This innovative polling system, when realized, will become a potential tool to enable us, the citizens, bring about whatever social change is needed.
Perpetual participation, or ongoing polling, is essentially what direct democracy is all about.
Hi everybody, my name is Harjap. I work as the BC Yukon Regional Organizer for the Council of Canadians, organization that basically works on a variety of issues, largely related to trade, water, climate change, and energy. In Bolivia, they had this conference where one of the slogans was system change, not climate change. And one of the things that they were doing there was that they were actually linking what happens in people's communities to the environment. What happens to people, what happens economically, what happens in terms of trade, in terms of looking at poverty, everything that you can think about as social struggles and other forms of struggles that you talk about, and how they're linked to environmental struggles. The days of us thinking, the environment is about trees and deer and grizzly bears needs to end, right? Because the environment is also about people. Right? People live on land, people have suffered because of environmental damage, people lose their livelihood because of environmental damage, and that's an extremely important thing for us to all remember. And I think that's what this idea of environmental justice and climate justice and these words that are being used now really does. And I think it's also a big shift from Copenhagen. I don't know how many of you were paying attention to what was happening in Copenhagen, but Copenhagen was not about environmental justice. So to remember that, trade is very much about environmental justice. When we talk about the Delta port and this gateway expansion, what is that about? That's about trade. We want to increase trade from the coastal communities of the US and bring in more imported goods and get stuff from China or get stuff from Europe possibly if you have a port on the eastern coast of Canada. A massive port expansion in Delta is encouraging trade. We talked about the Gateway project, Eric touched on it, but there's another gateway project that's happening in BC, which people might have heard of, and that's the port of Prince Rupert and the port of Kitimat. And there's talks about basically having a pipeline go through northern BC to carry tar sands crude oil. But in addition to that, there's talks about highway expansions, about rail expansion, about basically not just tar sands pipelines, but other forms of pipelines that are carrying diluent back to the tar sands. There's a lot of development in terms of the independent power projects, which many people here might have heard about, that are privatizing BC rivers, and a lot of that's happening in that area. But one of the things that concerns me a lot is that if we're really talking about the problem of the tar sands, there's very, very, very little talk about the Trans Mountain pipeline, which is supposed to be carrying oil from Edmonton down to Burnaby, northern Burnaby actually, where there's an oil refinery. This pipeline, if it's expanded, both of the Kinder Morgan pipelines that they're proposing, if they're completely expanded, their capacity can be upwards of, I think that what they're quoting in the Canadian Energy Pipeline Energy Producers Association, is that it'll be about 1.1 million barrels per day. And the Enbridge pipeline is about 400,000 barrels per day. So Enbridge is obviously a bigger issue in many ways because it's a new pipeline, and the one that I'm talking about already exists and they just want to expand it. But if we're talking about the tar sands and we don't want tar sands expansion, we really have to problematize even the expansion of this Trans Mountain pipeline, because that's really going to allow for tar sands expansion in that area. Fish Lake is a lake that's going to be destroyed by a mine and used as a tailings impoundment for acid waste. And this is something that's being allowed because of changes to the Fisheries Act at the federal level. The Fisheries Act, which is supposed to protect fish, is now allowing mining companies to apply to have lakes that have fish in them to be used as tailings impoundments for acid. IPPs are run-of-the-river private power projects that are being developed across the province. There's about 600 to 800 applications on different rivers and streams across the province, and they're basically mandated by the BC government for these projects to be private. right? BC Hydro can't really develop any of these renewable energy, small, environmentally friendly projects, even though these ones aren't even actually environmentally friendly. They have a huge impact on the sort of like spawning patterns and other things of fish in the area. They have a huge impact on the ecosystem. The Butte Inlet project is one of the biggest hydro projects ever, and a hydro project that big, like if it's that big, it just can't be that green, right? Like if you really think about what green is supposed to mean in terms of low impact and low footprint on the environment. So anyway, these projects, and this is where it came out, is that there is a segment of the environmental movement that wanted to tell us these projects were green. Right? There is an environmental movement that will say this, right? And this is where we have to talk about environmental justice. Because we ask these environmental organizations, and we ask them very simply, how can projects that are mandated to be private, therefore mandated to be for profit, therefore mandated to increase consumption, ever be about conservation? How is that possible, right? And there's an important element of that goes again back to the environmental justice idea, and that's the idea of democracy, right? And I'm not talking representative democracy like we have in Canada. I'm talking like grassroots radical democracy, where people should be in charge of what happens to their environment, where the people of Fort Chipewyan should be most empowered to say, no, we don't want the tar sands to develop, and people in Ottawa can't tell them otherwise. They should be able to say that, right? And that's going to be community level grassroots activism that's going to be happening. We can say that we don't want a for-profit, developing forever form of economics, and that's a part of the environmental justice movement. We can say that environmental justice is about moving people out of poverty and providing for everybody. And the reason why I brought this up as democracy is that in those scenarios and in those cases, unfortunately what happens is that industry sits with nonprofit organizations and the government and makes a decision about what should happen to those communities. Well, frankly, for me, unless the nonprofit organization is based in the community, they don't have any say in what should happen to that community, because that speaks in the face of grassroots radical democracy. Right? And that's what we have to reclaim as an environmental justice movement as well, right? Thanks.